to Medication Talk, the official podcast of TRC Healthcare, home of Pharmacist Letter, Prescriber's Letter, RX Advanced, and the most trusted clinical resources. On today's episode, listen in as our expert panel discusses the latest evidence regarding cardiovascular risks with testosterone replacement therapy in men with hypogonadism. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen Nissen from the Cleveland Clinic. You'll also hear practical advice from other panelists on TRC's Editorial Advisory Board, Dr. Douglas Paauw from the University of Washington School of Medicine, and Dr. Craig Williams from the Oregon Health and Science University. This podcast is an extract from TRC's Emerging Recommendations panel webinar. Each month, experts and frontline providers discuss current medication therapy topics and practical recommendations to include in TRC's letter articles. The full webinar originally aired on July 24, 2023.
And now, the CE information.
This podcast offers continuing education credit for pharmacists, physicians, and nurses. Please log into your Pharmacist Letter or Prescriber's Letter account and look for the title of this podcast in the list of available CE courses. For the purposes of disclosure, Dr. Stephen Nissen reports a relevant financial relationship by receiving grants or research support from AbbVie, Amgen, AstraZeneca, Bristol-Myers Squibb, Eli Lilly, Esperion, Medtronic, MyoKardia, New Amsterdam Pharma, Novartis, Pfizer, and Silence Therapeutics. The other speakers you'll hear have nothing to disclose. All relevant financial relationships have been mitigated. Now, let's join TRC editor, Dr. Sarah Clockers, and start our discussion.
We're talking about this now because new evidence will help clarify cardiovascular risk of testosterone replacement in men with hypogonadism. And so to kick off our discussion, Steve, can you give us some background as to why we have the phase 4 TRAVERSE trial looking at the cardiovascular safety of testosterone?
I would be pleased to. First of all, this goes back a long way. It goes back to 2010. The NIH sponsored a trial, a small trial, which was looking at the testosterone replacement therapy. And it was stopped by the Data Monitoring Committee because of an excess in cardiovascular events. Stopped early. And that information went to the FDA, and it did raise some alarm bells. There's been concerns about testosterone safety. So eventually in 2015, FDA put additional language in the labels to warn people about this is actually 2014, not 15, 2014. Actually, it actually 3/3/2015 about the safety of testosterone. And they told the 11 makers of testosterone products that they had to do a major outcome trial. They then came to us, and I was the study chair for this trial. It was very hard. We had to do it in the middle of the pandemic, but we did eventually get it done. And we got what I think is a useful answer, but with many questions remaining.
That is a great overview of the history. It's been going on for quite some time.
Yes.
So I think, before we dig into some of the trial specifics, could we just get an overview of the trial? Kind of looking at the study population, the size, the duration. I know we had some questions on our from our reviewers about, is this observational data or cohort? So I think we're going to try to work something in that it's a randomized trial. But if you could just give us some background.
Right. Well, what we designed was a randomized controlled trial. Like most modern trials, it was event-driven. The FDA wanted us to rule out an upper confidence interval of 1.5. Now, to do that, we needed about 256 morbid mortal events. And so it was designed to do that. And it ultimately required 5,200 odd patients to get enough events to qualify for answering the question of whether we could rule out an upper confidence interval of 1.5. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with non-inferiority trials, you need a point estimate of the hazard ratio of about 1.25 in order to rule out 1.5, 1.26 actually. So if we said seen more than a 26% increase in cardiovascular events, we would not have found non-inferiority.
So in our article, when we say, we suggest that transdermal testosterone gel daily for about 22 months, and then we have the target testosterone levels in there, does not increase risk of cardiovascular death, heart attack, or stroke more than placebo. Is that how you?
I would be, first of all, in public communications about this, I've been extremely cautious.
Mm-hmm.
This was a very carefully documented group of men that had what is known by endocrinologists as hypogonadism. I prefer the term androgen deficiency. They had to have a testosterone level of less than 300 nanograms per deciliter on 2 occasions, drawn in the morning. And they were then given testosterone gel, which was titrated to achieve levels between 350 and 750, not above that level. If they went above that level, even on the lowest dose, they were discontinued for safety reasons. And for this population, we did not see an excess of cardiovascular events. This is not, however, the population that's being treated with testosterone in the United States. FDA data shows that 50% of men who go to low T centers, which are cropping up in every shopping mall, are getting testosterone without even having their levels checked. And I want to be as clear as I can be that this is not an endorsement for using testosterone widely in aging men who did not meet the criteria for this trial.
You bring up a great point in that this trial actually goes along with the guidelines. So the Endocrinology Society, the AUA guidelines, you must have symptoms and the fasting testosterone levels below 300 on 2 occasions. And back to your comment earlier, Steve, about the FDA warning, they actually made all of the manufacturers put some wording into their package labeling.
Yes.
So we have that as well, where they, say that this is not for patients with age-related hypogonadism. So just to make that clear, I appreciate that point.
And it's also not for bodybuilders and athletes. And I mean, I think we all know that this is a drug that can be abused, which is why it's a controlled drug.
Yep. Great. And we had some questions come up about our wording in our article as well. And so I think we will put in there too, fasting total testosterones, or folks were asking about free testosterone levels. But I believe, the Traverse trial looked at the total serum testosterone levels.
We did, but we also, we have data on the free testosterone levels, but you can only design a trial around one parameter, and the most universally available is the total testosterone levels. So that's what we did. But it all gives you essentially the same answer, no matter how you look at it.
Yes. Okay, so we'll work on that.
Else that I want people to know about the trial. Whenever you do a trial in symptomatic patients, patient retention is difficult. And there was a very high rate of discontinuation of treatment and of people withdrawing consent for the trial. And the data are all in the manuscript, but I want to make sure everybody understands that if you're not taking a drug, you can't have a safety-related event. And so this was an intention to treat trial, which means that even people after they were off of study drug were continuing to be followed for morbid mortal events. And that can bias a trial toward the null hypothesis, towards a hazard ratio of 1. So we built in a principal sensitivity analysis that looked at people while on study drug and for a year thereafter. And we did post hoc analyses looking at people on study drug and for 30 days thereafter. And all of those analyses gave the same answer, very close to a neutral effect for testosterone. It does not mean, however, that there were not safety findings. There were other safety findings, some of which were unanticipated.
That's a great segue. Can we move on and discuss some of the adverse effects that you identified in the trial?
Yeah. So we did have a statistically significant excess of atrial fibrillation. The event rates were modest. They were, was 3.5% in the testosterone group and 2.4% in the placebo group. In the adjudicated endpoints table, that there was an excess of venous thromboembolic events, and there was an excess of pulmonary embolism cases. So those are all, things that people have to be aware of. And we do think that there are reasons to believe that testosterone can be prothrombotic, and we would urge caution in giving the drug to someone who's had a pulmonary embolism or any deep venous thrombosis. Now, the atrial fibrillation signal was not terribly strong, but if you look at all the non-fatal arrhythmias in the trial, it was highly significant. Number needed to harm you got there is relatively low, it's 52. Again, the acute kidney injury data, just at the borderline of statistical significance. And for people that are savvy about trials, you know that you can see this sort of thing by chance when you look at, dozens of safety endpoints. Getting something with a p-value of 0.04 is not uncommon. Having said that, people need to be aware of this, that we did not show that testosterone had no adverse effects. We showed that it did not increase the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events, but there were other safety events of concern.
Craig,
oh yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just asked real quick, I know one thing is that got changed as this piece was evolving, that this was transdermal, and reasons think that might be safer than other forms of testosterone people might be getting, especially at some of these kind of pop-up clinics, as Steve mentioned. But was there ever any discussion of using any other dosage form besides the transdermal, or Steve, or that was always the design from day one?
So that was designed from day one, mainly because the maker of the gel was the lead sponsor, and that was AbbVie, and they basically came up with a lot of the money. I will also tell you, I have reviewed the data for the injectables, and I agree with everything you said. There is a pretty strong signal on worsening hypertension with injectable forms of testosterone. I do not think we can consider these things to be entirely equivalent. I think what we showed was the relative cardiovascular safety of the topical gel, but I don't know about these other forms, and I do think that it's never going to be studied. So I think people just have to be aware that there are really significant risks.
So do you think we can still say, plus there are still uncertainties with other dosage forms and with longer term use? So a lot of people will get started on testosterone and may not get the labs done, or they may get the labs done, and this trial is only 22 months. And so,
Sarah, your point is very well taken, that we studied these people for a median of 22 months. There are men that are going to be on this therapy for 5 and even 10 years, and we did not, we couldn't do a trial like that. It was would have been just logistically almost impossible. As it is, this was very difficult to get done. So I do think that long-term use has uncertainties without question. I would also want to point out to you that when we presented the data at the Endocrine Society, we presented data on 5 of the 7 sub-studies, and one of them gave a very big surprise. And this will be published, but there was an excess of fractures in men that got testosterone. And the fracture subcommittee that took a look at this, they adjudicated these fractures, were astonished, because it has been believed for a long time that testosterone improves bone health rather than worsens bone health. That's not what we saw in the trial. And stay tuned, and we'll give you more details when that manuscript is published.
that's great. I was going to actually ask about some of the other things that the Traverse trial looked at, and that was one of them. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, were a couple of others just before we lose all of our time. There was a study on anemia, and that will also be published. And we reported at the Endocrine Society meeting that that testosterone did correct anemia in anemic men more often than placebo, and it prevented development of anemia in men during the course of the trial. So there was a favorable effect. We'll be reporting on the changes in sexual function and mood and depression. We collected as much data as we could about both the safety, but also of the efficacy of testosterone in relieving the symptoms of concern.
That's great, and some much needed data to help guide some decisions. Yeah. So I wanted to kind of get into the bottom line that we're gonna say in our article, and it's basically aligning with the guidelines, aligning what we talked about earlier with the trials, considering testosterone only for men with symptoms and low testosterone. And levels under 300 don't automatically need treatment unless you also have symptoms. And then we go on to say a little bit about where the evidence is, and you alluded to some of this, but right now, currently, testosterone may provide a small improvement in libido or erectile function, but published data to date, there's no benefit for low energy, cognitive impairment, fatigue, quality of life that we're aware of. So do you agree, kind of with this bottom line for our readers?
Yeah, I do agree with it. Again, without giving away the subsequent, there's going to be a whole series of manuscripts, many of them published in top tier journals that are going to tell you more about everything that the drug does, including its effect on sexual function and libido. Mm-hmm. And we collected as much information as we could, knowing that this trial would only be done once, never going to be done again. So we did everything we could. And we also collected data on prostate health. Mm-hmm. A lot of concern about testosterone and prostate health. We did not see an excess of either high-grade or low-grade prostate cancers in those men that were randomized to testosterone. But again, that was only for 22 months. Carcinogenic effects of drugs generally take many years to develop. So I'm not sure we've ruled that out entirely.
Mm-hmm. Craig, do you want to comment on when you decide or have a discussion with a patient about using testosterone, how do you kind of have that conversation discussing the pros and cons?
Yeah, honestly, outside of our specialists doing this for, in some obviously special pediatric cases, and it's say in adult cases where it's pretty clear, there truly is a hypogonadism issue. It's in the otherwise, I don't know, healthy worried, or how we might want to explain, like for the symptoms we have up here in the last slide, as far as low libido, erectile dysfunction, patients who perceive there might be a cognitive benefit, we're just not initiating there, and I don't know of any of our specialists doing it there either, at least in the academic setting. So, and it's a little against the endocrine guidelines to just, symptoms and the testosterone level below X. It's just, there's still a lot of questions there. So that gives me to, benefits maybe to come from this. But if it looks like the benefits aren't fantastic, this is, a lot of times I tell my students, learners, like an absence of something bad is not a reason to use a drug. It's, you need to see the good. And so I'll look forward to the good that's coming. But yeah, the literature now doesn't support a lot of benefit. People don't have a clear hypogonadism state. So we're just not doing this much in patients.
I think we need to be clear that men seek this treatment because they anticipate the fountain of youth. They want to have the sexual performance they had when they were 18 years old, and they want to have stronger muscles and all of that. And the promise of this transforming people's lives is a false promise. And on the other hand, if you have the symptoms troubling, and you have documented low levels on 2 occasions, it's not unreasonable to give this a try, assuming that you don't have high risk of thromboembolism or atrial fibrillation. I think those things would give me pause, but it's also not unreasonable but also explain to men that they should not expect a dramatic change in their physical functioning when they get on testosterone therapy.
Yep. And we did have some questions come up, and a couple of our reviewers brought up the intramuscular forms being linked to more cardiovascular events. So I know in 2015 there was a retrospective cohort that kind of looked into this, and the intramuscular injectable forms were linked to more events. And so we had some reviewers that said they would prefer to use the transdermal if they were going to use this in their patients. I don't know if Craig, you want to talk about that, or?
Yeah, I don't know if we can say a lot more than our earlier comments, just that there'd be reasons to think that other systemic form, there's oral options as well. And the more you're putting these hormones through the liver, a lot of the coagulopathies probably come from effects in hepatocytes. And
yes,
the analogy of estrogen in women, we learned a lot of lessons about hormone replacement therapy in women 30 years ago and 20 years ago. And there's evidence there too that transdermal doesn't carry the risk. And that's a great other topic for another time, but there's analogous lessons learned from hormone replacement therapy in women, and reasons to believe that, pharmacologically, intramuscular and especially oral, but any non-transdermal form, just not the same. Serum levels might be different, levels exposed in the cardiac tissue and liver tissue be different. So as Steve says, this is a relative safety of a transdermal product, I think, is the bottom line for the study. And so I would stick to transdermal if I'm trying to avoid adverse cardiovascular events at this point.
Yeah, I think Craig is absolutely right in what he says. But the other thing is that we should, men should understand that they should seek treatment from a recognized expert in hypogonadism. Often that's an endocrinologist or a urologist, although it can certainly be a generalist or a family practitioner, but it has to be somebody who's knowledgeable about this. And I don't want men going to these low T centers. You can even get it, over the internet. I just don't think that's a safe approach. And I think we've got to strongly discourage people from doing that.
Yeah. Do you have any pearls or tips or conversations that have worked well for you? We actually had a question come in. How do you talk about this with patients in light of the low T supplement TV ads?
Yeah. Well, I get the question from my cardiovascular patients, and they say, gee, they want to get on testosterone therapy, and they often went to one of these shopping mall places, and often they will tell me they never had their testosterone level checked, and when I actually check it, they're completely within the normal range. And so, I think having a conversation, that's why, it's why we publish these things, is so the medical community, and frankly, from the pharmacy community, I think pharmacists are a great source of information here. And I want to make sure that everybody understands the nuances here, that while we did show non-inferiority, this is by no means an endorsement for the inappropriate and widespread use of testosterone as a fountain of youth for aging men.
I think just to add to that, those are great comments. That if someone does have low testosterone levels and they have symptoms, they may not feel better. So don't be afraid to make sure you're circling back, and 6-12 months later things don't feel better. It's not going to kick in at year 5, year 6. As you said, this is safety data for a little under 2 years. So don't be afraid to stop therapies if patients are feeling like it's
the favorable effects often emerge within 3 months. I mean, so
I can do that. Yeah,
you don't even need a year to do that. And by the way, keep in mind, you got to follow hematocrit. I mean, we stopped the drug if they, on the lowest dose, if the hematocrit went above 54%, and some of them did. So those are all things that have to be thought about. And I think this concept of stopping it if symptoms don't improve in 6 to 12 months is very, very good advice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I like
that's
that
a
advice for lots of drugs I'm not a huge fan of. Gabapentinoids too. I try it, but ask them and stop it soon if it's not working. So yeah.
We did
Steve,
have. Sorry. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, Steve, I thought that what you mentioned about the bone was really intriguing because for me, that's been the one thing that I felt, identifying some of these folks might be an issue. Some of them have a little lower bone mass because of their hypogonadism. And I think that's really helpful information because I agree totally with the points made about the limited benefits. I think for me, from my patients who have been looking for it, the one thing I've seen some benefit for has been potentially libido, but the other things I totally haven't seen any benefit. And the bone density thing was the one thing in fractures that I felt sort of that I needed to be more aggressive to look for. And anyway, I find that intriguing.
You'll want to look carefully when we publish it at the effects on libido in the testosterone group and in the placebo group. One of the most effective ways to increase libido that I know of is placebo. And you may remember that that's what happened in a study of using testosterone to increase libido in women, is the placebo group did almost as well as the treated group. So, it'll be interesting. You'll all want to take a look at the placebo control data, which I think will be more illuminating.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And so before we move on, we did have many questions coming in about monitoring. So if we could just go back to that topic real quick.
Yeah.
In our article, we have, to monitor testosterone hematocrit in 3 to 6 months. And I believe then the guidelines recommend every 6 to 12 months thereafter. Different guidelines say different things, but I just didn't know how often did you check in the study or how often would you check in practice?
Well, let's talk about practice first of all, because that's what really people want to know about.
Mm-hmm.
I would start it. I would check levels in 3 months. And as you suggested here, PSA is going to go up, by the way. It does go up. We know that. But, it's not, at least not producing an acute carcinogenic effect. I think you check testosterone levels, you check hematocrit. If levels are still low, you titrate to the next highest dose level. And you do that until you get into a therapeutic range. And once you're there, you can probably not measure it as often, maybe every 6 months thereafter.
Okay. Sounds like a good recommendation, and that's what I've seen in the guidelines, so that's helpful. We might actually add that in. We also had some feedback about the PSA kind of being controversial, and you wouldn't necessarily need to check that. So we might edit this wording. And then definitely keep the stop if symptoms don't improve. Awesome.
Yeah.
I want to share a clinical resource with you. We have a nice chart on the comparison of testosterone products. Has dosing and monitoring, and it reviews the pros and cons of each formulation. There's even some tips for application and also, best timing to draw or to check testosterone levels, since each formulation, peaks at a different time, that sort of thing. So check out this great chart.
We hope you enjoyed and gained practical insights from listening into this discussion. Now that you've listened, pharmacists, physicians, and nurses can receive CE credit. Just log into your pharmacist letter or prescriber's letter account and look for the title of this podcast in the list of available CE courses. You'll also be able to access and print out additional materials on this topic, like charts and other quick reference tools from the pharmacist letter and prescriber's letter websites. If you're not yet a pharmacist letter or prescriber's letter subscriber, find out more about our product offerings at trchealthcare.com. Be sure to follow or subscribe, rate, and review this show in your favorite podcast app. It helps spread the word about our show and is a great way for you to let us know how we're doing. You can also reach out to provide feedback or make suggestions by emailing us at contactus@trchealthcare.com. Thanks for listening to Medication Talk.